Thank you all for watching and supporting my videos. Your encouragement keeps me inspired to create even more content. My next big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers, and I can't do it without your help. If you enjoy what I create, hit that subscribe button and join me on this journey. Now, let's dive into the stories. John and Sarah Peters had long dreamed of owning their own farm. After years of hard work in the city, they purchased a small homestead deep in the heart of Wisconsin. The farm, named Riverside, was a quiet place surrounded by dense forests, with fertile fields and an old but sturdy house. The first few weeks were filled with excitement. They brought in chickens, a few goats, and a couple of cows. Everything seemed perfect: clean air, fresh milk, and a peaceful silence they couldn't find in the city. But soon, strange events began to unfold. One morning, John stepped outside and discovered one of the chickens was missing. Sarah suggested it might have been coyotes. They reinforced the fence, set traps, and installed lights. But the next night, 2 more chickens disappeared. Sarah proposed they ask their neighbor, Mr. Graham, who had lived in the area all his life. The old farmer was friendly but issued a warning. Riverside has its history. The previous owner, Mr. Randall, vanished a few years ago. People say he saw something he wasn't supposed to see. The couple found his words unsettling, but they decided to brush them off. One evening, John heard a strange noise coming from the barn. Armed with a flashlight and a shovel, he went to investigate. The barn was silent, with the cows calmly chewing their hay. But when John returned to the house, he noticed something strange on the porch: barefoot tracks leading from the forest to the house. Sarah insisted they call the sheriff, but John decided to figure things out on his own. The next night, he stayed outside with a flashlight and a rifle. At first, the night seemed uneventful, but around 3 a.m., he heard sounds from the forest, voices, faint and distant. Following the noise, he ventured into the woods and stumbled upon an old, abandoned shed he had never seen before. Inside, he found scattered tools, evidence of someone's presence, and a notebook with Randall's name on it. With each passing day, the events grew more mysterious: livestock continued to disappear, and shadows were seen moving in the forest. Sarah pleaded with John to sell the farm, but he was determined to uncover the truth. John decided to return to the old shed. He studied Randall's notes, finding some peculiar entries. Silence at night doesn't always mean peace, and find the source of light when darkness consumes everything. These phrases seemed strange, but John was determined to uncover their meaning. Over the next few days, he spent hours searching. He combed through the woods surrounding the farm, looking for anything that might explain the missing livestock and the mysterious events. However, he found nothing definitive, only tracks leading deeper into the forest. He tried setting traps, but they proved useless. One evening, as Sarah grew weary of the endless searching and anxiety, John returned home with a new discovery. He had found another old structure that wasn't mentioned in any records. It was located on the forest's edge, at the base of a hill, not far from the farm. When John entered, he discovered more old tools and documents belonging to Randall. Among them was one particularly intriguing item: a map marking a hidden tunnel beneath the farm. Realizing he had stumbled upon something significant, John shared his findings with Sarah. Together, they decided to explore the tunnel. That night, they set out with lanterns, heading to the old structure. After navigating through overgrown patches, they uncovered the tunnel entrance, hidden underground and camouflaged with ancient stones. The tunnel was cold and damp, their hearts pounding with every step. They eventually reached a small chamber resembling an underground storage room. Strange symbols and drawings adorned the walls, none of which they could interpret. Randall must have known about this place, and perhaps it was the source of his fear. They found several old boxes containing various items, and among them was a large book. John opened it to discover pages filled with descriptions of ancient rituals and bizarre beliefs. A deep sense of dread washed over them as they reached the final page, which read, "The silence of the night is merely the pause before the arrival of what is to come." In that moment, sharp noises echoed through the tunnel, as if someone, or something, was approaching. John grabbed Sarah's hand, and they hurried to escape. But suddenly, the doors behind them slammed shut, plunging them into darkness. That night, there was no peace at Riverside Farm. The question was no longer whether they could stay but whether they could survive what lay ahead. John and Sarah managed to escape the tunnel, though with great difficulty. When the doors finally reopened, they found themselves in the forest, shrouded in complete darkness, overcome with deep unease. Their hearts pounded wildly as they made their way back to the farm. Exchanging glances, they realized that what they had uncovered would change everything. In the following days, John became more cautious. He didn't share his thoughts with Sarah, but he began to suspect that the events happening on the farm were not mere coincidences. The tunnel and Randall's notes had a significance he couldn't yet grasp, but John wasn't ready to enter it again. He decided to thoroughly investigate the area around the farm instead. He enlisted the help of their neighbor, Mr. Graham, an old-timer who had lived in the area for years. Even Graham had no knowledge of the tunnel, but after seeing Randall's maps and notes, he began recalling old stories passed down by the locals. Many years ago, the area was notorious for strange occurrences. People whispered about nocturnal creatures lurking in the forest, beings that didn't belong to this world. Most dismissed the tales as folklore, but John was no longer so sure of his doubts. Meanwhile, Sarah grew increasingly worried about John. She noticed he had become distant and preoccupied. She couldn't understand why he spent so much time around the farm yet always found reasons to avoid her. Determined to uncover the truth, Sarah decided to investigate on her own. One day, she ventured to the old building where the tunnel entrance was hidden and entered without warning. Fear gripped her, but she knew something had to change, or they would never escape the grip of this farm. Inside the tunnel, she noticed fresh tracks that clearly didn't belong to either Randall or John. If she hadn't seen them in time, she might have stayed safely unaware. Sarah descended further, and this time, she discovered that the room they had reached earlier had changed. Something was different. Part of the walls had collapsed, revealing old photographs scattered among the rubble. One of them depicted a large group of people standing in front of the same farm, their faces aged and worn. But one man in the center of the photograph stood out. It was Randall. Sarah took the photograph, and as she raised her head, she noticed dark figures moving through the tunnel toward her. It became clear that these shadows were no mere illusions. She fled the tunnel, her heart pounding in her chest. Returning to John, she showed him what she had found. Together, they began searching for answers to the mysteries surrounding the farm. But even after combing through all of Randall's documents, the truth remained elusive. Before long, it became evident that every day spent on the farm brought them closer to something they couldn't comprehend. At night, as they lay in bed, unfamiliar sounds echoed from the forest and the old building. Sometimes, it felt as though they weren't alone on this land. John and Sarah realized they could no longer ignore what was happening around them. Every attempt to leave the farm seemed futile. The place had become a part of their lives, and no matter how hard they tried to escape it, the mysteries of Riverside remained. John decided it was time to uncover the truth once and for all. He turned to the local townspeople again, hoping to learn more about Randall and the farm. The older residents who remembered him said that Randall had been reclusive, often disappearing for weeks at a time. They claimed he was obsessed with something, rituals he performed deep in the forest, and that after his disappearance, strange, inexplicable events began occurring on the farm. One day, while Sarah stayed at home, John returned to the old building and opened one of the chests containing Randall's belongings, the same chests they had found earlier. Inside, he discovered letters and notes, but there was also something else, a large, hand-carved statue made of dark stone. The statue depicted a strange figure resembling a human but with eyes that seemed unnervingly realistic. The object was heavy, and John immediately sensed its significance. He recalled Mr. Graham's words about the area's long-standing reputation for mystical tales. But were these just old superstitions, or was there truly some unseen force in the forest? As he held the statue, Sarah approached quietly from behind and said, "John, I think we need to leave the farm. We can't keep living like this. This place is trying to pull us in." John looked at her. It was hard for him to let go of his dream of a peaceful life on the farm, but he also knew he couldn't keep fighting against forces he didn't understand. They decided to sell the farm. All their belongings were packed, and they finally left Riverside. But as John took one last look at the farm, he noticed a strange, dreamy glimmer on the horizon. Something from the statue? Something connected to the tunnel? This farm had left a mystery in their hearts that no one could unravel. But ultimately, John and Sarah understood that their tranquil vision of farm life had never truly belonged to them. Their freedom began anew, wherever they chose to live next. Riverside remained in their memories as a place where they would no longer seek answers. And though they left the farm, the mystery of Riverside remained unsolved. Someday, someone else might find themselves on that same path. Emily and Mark had always dreamed of a quiet life far from the noise of the city. When they came across a small farm for sale deep in the countryside, it seemed like the perfect opportunity. The price was surprisingly low, but the realtor's vague answers about its history didn't bother them. They were too excited about starting fresh. The farm was picturesque, a weathered barn, a charming farmhouse, and acres of golden cornfields stretching toward the horizon. Yet, from the moment they arrived, there was a strange stillness about the place. No birds sang, no insects buzzed, and the air felt heavy, as though it carried the weight of something unseen. Their first night on the farm passed uneventfully, until around midnight. Emily woke to the faint sound of rustling outside their bedroom window. At first, she thought it was the wind, but when she looked out, the cornfield seemed unnaturally still, despite the noise. She shook Mark awake, but by the time he looked, the sound had stopped. "It's probably just a raccoon," Mark said, though his voice betrayed a hint of unease. The following morning, they decided to explore the property. As they walked through the cornfield, Emily noticed something strange. Several stalks of corn were bent, forming what looked like a crude symbol. It wasn't random, it was deliberate. "Kids playing pranks," Mark muttered, though he avoided meeting Emily's eyes. Later that day, while clearing out the barn, they discovered an old journal tucked behind a loose plank in the wall. The leather cover was cracked with age, and the pages were filled with cramped, frantic handwriting. The entries were dated over 70 years ago, written by someone named Samuel Hayes, the farm's original owner. The entries began normally, detailing farm life, but soon took a dark turn. Samuel wrote about hearing whispers from the cornfield at night and seeing shadows move between the rows. He described feeling watched, even inside the house. The last entry read, "The shadow grows stronger. If you find this, leave before it takes you too." That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, staring out at the moonlit cornfield. At first, everything was still. Then she saw it, a tall, dark figure standing at the edge of the field. Its form was indistinct, more like a shadow than a person. It didn't move, but Emily felt its gaze, cold and piercing. She woke Mark, but by the time he looked, the figure was gone. "Emily, you're letting that journal get to you," he said, though he locked the doors and windows before they went back to bed. Determined to uncover the truth, they decided to investigate the cornfield during the day. Mark carried a flashlight and a crowbar, while Emily clutched a notebook to document anything unusual. As they ventured deeper, the air grew colder, and the stalks seemed to close in around them. At the center of the field, they discovered a clearing. In the middle stood a crude stone altar, covered in strange carvings. The ground around it was scorched, as if burned by fire, though there was no sign of recent activity. Emily's flashlight flickered, and she felt a sudden wave of nausea. Mark stepped closer to the altar and found a rusty knife lying on top. The blade was stained dark, as though it had been used for something sinister. "Samuel's journal mentioned rituals," Emily whispered. "Do you think?" Before Mark could answer, they heard the sound of footsteps behind them, slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. They spun around, but no one was there. That night, the noises intensified. Scratching sounds came from the walls, and the whispers grew louder. Emily and Mark stayed awake, clutching each other as the shadowy figure appeared outside their window again. This time, it didn't stay still, it began to move toward the house. In a panic, Mark grabbed the journal and began flipping through it, searching for answers. Near the back, he found a sketch of the altar with a warning scrawled beneath it: "Destroy the stone, and it may weaken the shadow. But beware, it won't let you go without a fight." Desperate, they decided to act. Armed with a sledgehammer, they returned to the altar at dawn. The air was thick with tension, and every step felt like a struggle. As Mark raised the hammer, the shadow appeared, more solid and menacing than before. It let out a sound, a deep, guttural growl that reverberated through the air. Emily screamed, but Mark swung the hammer with all his strength, shattering the altar into pieces. The ground trembled, and the shadow let out a piercing wail before dissolving into the air. The strange occurrences stopped after that. The whispers, the shadow, the cold unease, they all vanished. Emily and Mark decided to stay on the farm, hopeful that the worst was behind them. But sometimes, late at night, Emily still hears faint rustling in the cornfield. And she can't shake the feeling that they didn't truly destroy the shadow, only buried it deeper. Months passed since the altar was destroyed, and the unease that once gripped Emily and Mark seemed to dissipate. The farm became quieter, and the couple resumed their daily routines. They even began to enjoy the peacefulness of their new life. The cornfield flourished, the barn was repaired, and the farmhouse began to feel like home. But as time went on, strange things began to happen again. It started subtly. Emily would hear faint whispers late at night, always when the wind was still. At first, she thought it was the wind itself, or perhaps the house settling. But the whispers began to form words, disjointed and incomprehensible at first, but growing clearer with each passing night. One evening, as Emily sat in the kitchen, the voice seemed to call her name softly. "Emily. Emily." She froze, her heart racing. She looked around the room, but saw nothing. Mark was upstairs, unaware of the growing unease in her chest. After a few moments, she shook it off, thinking it was her imagination playing tricks. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. The whispers had followed her into her dreams, where she found herself standing in the cornfield, unable to move. A dark figure, an indistinct shadow, loomed before her, its presence suffocating. It reached out with long, skeletal fingers, and she could feel its cold touch on her skin. She awoke with a start, sweating and panting. Mark turned over, his sleep disturbed. "Everything okay?" he asked groggily. Emily nodded, trying to calm her racing heart. "Just a nightmare," she whispered, though a lingering dread made her uneasy. The next day, she told Mark about the whispers and the dream. He listened quietly, his expression hardening. He had never truly believed in the supernatural, but after everything that had happened with the altar, he couldn't deny that something had changed on the farm. "We've been through this before," he said, trying to sound reassuring. "Maybe it's just stress. You know how isolated we've been. We should visit town, get away for a bit." But Emily wasn't so sure. Something felt different this time. The air around the farm had a weight to it, and the whispers were louder, almost demanding. Weeks passed, and things began to change on the farm. The crops in the cornfield began to wilt, despite their best efforts to care for them. The once thriving plants now appeared sickly and stunted, their leaves curling as if something was draining the life from them. Emily and Mark tried everything they could think of to revive the field, from better irrigation to new fertilizers, but nothing worked. The land seemed to be withering before their eyes. One evening, Emily went out to check the crops, her steps slow and heavy. As she walked toward the cornfield, she noticed something odd. The corn was growing in twisted, unnatural patterns. The rows no longer stood in neat lines but instead spiraled, creating strange, almost sinister formations. Suddenly, she heard a sound behind her, footsteps crunching through the dry grass. She turned around, but no one was there. A chill ran down her spine as the whispers returned, louder now, filling the air around her. "Emily." She sprinted back to the house, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts. When she reached the door, she found Mark standing in the entryway, looking pale. "There's something wrong with the house," he said, his voice tight. It's shifting. I can't explain it." That night, as they sat in the living room, Emily's mind raced. The strange occurrences were happening too often now to be ignored. She began to think back to the journal and the warnings that Samuel Hayes had left. The ritual, the shadow, the altar, none of it had truly been stopped. Perhaps they had only delayed it. Emily looked at Mark. "I think we need to go deeper," she said quietly. "There's something we missed." Mark nodded. "I agree. I've been thinking the same thing." The next morning, they returned to the spot where the altar had stood, determined to find anything they may have overlooked. As they dug through the earth, their shovels struck something hard, stone. It was the altar, or rather, what remained of it. The stone had been cracked, but under the surface, something was different. Mark scraped away the dirt and revealed an inscription etched into the stone, hidden beneath the layers of earth. The words were in a language neither of them recognized, but one thing was clear: the ritual hadn't been completed. The altar wasn't meant to stop the shadow, it was a binding, a seal that kept it from escaping. Suddenly, the wind picked up, howling through the cornfield. A shadow stretched across the land, darker than any cloud, moving swiftly toward them. "We've made a mistake," Emily whispered, realizing that whatever had been contained was now free. They ran back to the house, but it was too late. The shadow was already there, swirling around the farmhouse, blocking out the sunlight. Emily and Mark were trapped. Inside, the air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder, as if coming from all directions. They couldn't tell where the sound was coming from, but they could feel it. Something was watching them. The shadow took form, not as a figure, but as a presence that filled the house. Mark and Emily huddled together, knowing there was only one way to end this nightmare. They had to finish the ritual. But to do so, they would have to face the shadow itself. The farmhouse was enveloped in an unnatural stillness, as if the very air had been drained of life. Emily and Mark stood in the center of the living room, the whispers growing louder and louder with each passing second. The shadow outside pressed against the walls of the house, like a suffocating force, threatening to break through. "Mark, we have to finish this," Emily said, her voice shaking but determined. She grasped the old journal tightly, remembering the final page she had found, the one that described how the ritual was supposed to end. "We can't just run. We've let this thing out, and now it's going to consume everything." Mark nodded, his face pale but resolute. "What do we need to do?" Emily glanced down at the journal again, her eyes scanning the words. "We need to recreate the altar, the one that was destroyed. We need to find the exact spot where it was, and we have to perform the ritual exactly as it was written. It's the only way to bind it back." The two of them exchanged a brief, nervous glance before Mark grabbed the shovel. They didn't have time to hesitate. The shadow outside was growing, pressing against the windows with an eerie, unnatural force. The whispers had turned into growls, like distant thunder, vibrating through the walls of the house. They rushed outside and made their way back to the spot where the altar had once stood, now partially obscured by the overgrown corn. The air was thick with tension, and the wind seemed to have a life of its own, pushing them forward. When they reached the location, Emily felt a chill run down her spine. It was the same spot, but there was something different now. The earth felt cold, even through her thick gloves. She knelt down, searching for any trace of the old altar, but it was gone, destroyed, buried beneath layers of soil and time. "Do you feel that?" Mark asked quietly, his voice strained. Emily nodded. "It's here. It's close." They began digging, frantically scraping at the earth. Each shovelful felt heavier than the last, the ground beneath them feeling almost alive, as if something was pushing back against them. They dug deeper, the whispers now growing into a full-throated wail, as if the land itself was protesting. Finally, Emily's shovel struck something hard, a large stone, cracked and weathered by time. Her heart raced as she wiped the dirt away, revealing the faint outline of a symbol etched into the surface. It was the same symbol she had seen in the journal, the one that was supposed to contain the shadow. Mark bent down beside her. "Is this it? Is this the altar?" Emily nodded, breathing heavily. "Yes. It's the foundation, but we need to finish what we started. We need to make it whole again." They gathered the items they had found in the barn, candles, salt, and some of the old ritual objects that had been scattered around the house. The ritual required precise placement, an offering to the shadow to bind it back to where it belonged. But there was something in the journal that gave Emily pause. "Mark," she said, her voice trembling. "This part. It says we need to offer a life, an unwilling sacrifice." Mark's face turned pale. "What do you mean?" "We can't." "I don't know what it means exactly," Emily whispered. "But it says the ritual requires blood. And not just any blood, but someone tied to the land, someone who's been marked by it." They both looked around, the wind picking up violently, rattling the trees and causing the corn to rustle unnaturally. It felt like the land was alive, like it was watching them. "Emily, we can't do this. This is insane," Mark said, his voice shaking with fear. But before Emily could respond, the ground trembled beneath their feet. A deep, guttural sound filled the air, like a growl coming from the earth itself. The shadows in the cornfield moved, shifting in ways that defied logic, coiling like serpents. The shadow's form began to take shape again, taller, darker, more defined than before. It loomed over them, casting a suffocating presence on the land. Its cold eyes locked onto Emily and Mark, and they could feel it reaching into their minds, trying to pull them into its grasp. "You have disturbed what should have remained," the shadow rumbled, its voice like gravel scraping across stone. "You cannot undo what has already been done." Emily, panic rising in her chest, grabbed the ritual knife she had found in the barn. Her hands were shaking, but she knew she had no choice. They had already gone too far to turn back. The shadow seemed to pause, as if it was considering them. Then it lunged forward, faster than anything they had ever seen. Mark cried out as he was thrown back, his body slamming into the ground. Emily struggled to her feet, adrenaline flooding her veins. The shadow turned toward her, its cold eyes boring into hers. In that moment, she realized what she had to do. Emily reached into her pocket and pulled out the small vial of blood she had taken from the animals earlier. She didn't want to do it, but the journal had been clear. The sacrifice needed to be made. With trembling hands, she poured the blood onto the altar, chanting the words from the journal. The ground shook violently as the shadow screeched, trying to break free. But it was too late. Emily completed the final incantation, and with a deafening roar, the shadow was pulled back into the earth, disappearing as quickly as it had come. The wind died down, the eerie whispers fading into silence. Emily collapsed to her knees, her body exhausted from the strain. Mark slowly got to his feet, his face pale but alive. He didn't speak, but his eyes said everything. They had survived, but at what cost? The land was still, unnaturally so. They looked at each other, knowing that the farm had changed them. They had fought the shadow and won, but the price of victory was heavy. They knew that whatever evil had been unleashed on this land could never truly be erased. The cornfield stood silent around them, as if waiting for something. They had to leave. The silence around them felt deafening, like the land was holding its breath. Emily and Mark stood there for a long moment, their minds reeling from the events they had just survived. The ritual had worked, the shadow had been banished, but the weight of what they had done, and what they had narrowly escaped, hung heavily in the air. Mark wiped the dirt from his face, looking at Emily with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. Is it over? Is it really over? Emily glanced at the empty cornfield, the air still and heavy. She didn't know. She couldn't know for sure. But the feeling in her gut told her that the land would never be the same, and neither would they. I don't know, she said softly. But we can't stay here anymore. We can't risk it. Mark nodded without hesitation. Agreed. They packed up as best as they could, collecting the few belongings that hadn't been destroyed or lost in the chaos. The farm, once a place of hope and dreams, now felt like a prison, the very ground beneath them seeming to pulse with a dark history. They didn't speak as they made their way back to the farmhouse to gather the last of their things. It wasn't long before the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land. The eerie quiet continued, and the occasional rustle of the cornfield seemed almost mocking in its stillness. It was as if the earth itself was waiting for them to leave, and it was only once they had packed up and driven down the long dirt road that they felt some semblance of relief. But as they drove, the feeling of being watched didn't leave. Emily kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the shadow from the cornfield following them, but there was nothing. No dark figure, no eyes. Just the empty road stretching out in front of them. I think we're free, Mark said after a long silence, his voice quiet, unsure. But we'll never be the same, Emily finished for him. Mark didn't reply, but the sadness in his eyes spoke volumes. They had both been marked by this place, touched by something that could never be fully understood. As they drove further away, the farmhouse growing smaller in the distance, Emily could almost hear the whisper of the wind through the corn one last time. It was faint, almost a memory, but it still echoed in her mind. The land was alive with secrets, and some of them would never be revealed. They eventually reached the town, the familiar sights of everyday life offering a strange sense of comfort. But neither of them spoke of what had happened. The people in town didn't know, and they would never need to know. The farm had been a part of their lives, a chapter they could never erase. And though they had survived, they knew better than to speak of it. The shadow was gone, at least for now, but the land had changed, and they, too, had changed with it. But in the deep corners of their minds, the question lingered. Had they truly sealed away the darkness, or had they only pushed it into hiding, waiting for the next time someone, somewhere, would unknowingly disturb it again? The road ahead of them was uncertain, but one thing was clear, they were leaving the farm behind, and the past along with it. Or at least, that's what they told themselves. For the rest of their lives, they would carry the haunting memories of Riverside with them, a place that would always live on in their minds. As a warning to never underestimate the darkness that can be buried in the earth. And for as long as they lived, they would never forget the whispers in the cornfield.